Let's continue the lesson with learning how to write counterexamples. We've spoken about this a little bit last year and a little bit this year. And basically, well, first of all, write down your title, Writing Counterexamples. Basically, counterexamples are just proving a statement wrong. So showing some instance in which that statement is incorrect or false. So I'm going to put proving incorrect or false. So let's look at an example. If x squared equals 81, this is one of those conditional statements because we have the if, and then x equals 9. So immediately you might look at that and go, yeah, that's true. However, if you're trying to come up with a counterexample, so let's write counterexample, there's always those instances and make that 2 words. There's always those instances where you're going to find maybe a number that will prove it wrong. So looking at that, we have x squared equals 81, and they're saying that x equals 9, and that does work. However, there is an instance, and we learned this last year and the year before, where you need another number when you have a squared variable. So the other number that would fit into this would be x equals -9. So they're saying this is the only instance in which x squared equals 81, x equals 9. You can provide a counterexample and say no, x equals -9. The hypothesis in your statement above is true. However, the conclusion is false. And what I mean by that is if you plug this in to your hypothesis, the if part, so we're going to go -9 squared equals 81, that's true. But then it says that x must equal 9, and that is not true. It has to be a -9 as well. So that's an example of writing a counterexample. Now we're going to learn how to do the converse of a conditional statement. So go ahead and title it Converse, and not the shoes, of a conditional statement. When we look at the converse, basically all you're doing is switching your hypothesis and your conclusion. So switch hypothesis and conclusion. So in the statement that I'm going to provide, we're going to start with the conditional. So go ahead and write just C-O-N-D. So if you are in period 1, Jake's, then you are learning math. So this statement's true. Period 1, we learn math in here. Let's do the converse of that statement. So put C-O-N-V for converse. So we're just going to switch our conclusion and our hypothesis. So if you are learning math, then you are in period 1 Jakes. Well, for our class, that's definitely true. However, if it's applied to our school, if we were saying that to our school, if you are learning math, then you are in period 1 Jakes. That is not always true. So when you do the converse, it may change the validity of the statement. So not always true. Next, I'm going to turn my page, and we're going to talk about negation. If I negate someone, I go against what they're saying. So negation. So as I said before, you're going to see a lot of vocabulary in this lesson. So with negation, you're going to write the negative of the sentence or the statement, right? The negative. So let's look at an example. So let's say the statement says that we're dealing with angles. So it says the measurement of angle B equals 40 degrees. And this is just given, they gave it to us. Therefore, angle B is acute. And we learned what acute meant, less than 90 degrees. I'm going to put this little dot, dot, and dot. That means therefore. Let's negate it. Let's do the negation of that statement. So negation. So the negation of that statement is you're going to start and you're going to change the hypothesis. So the measurement of angle B does not equal 40 degrees. It could be any other degrees, but it doesn't equal 40 degrees. So then I'm going to negate change the color again. I'm going to negate what they said. So I'm going to say that angle B is not acute. Well, you could say that that's true. However, if you're looking at it, you have 40 degrees. It could be 45. It could be 36. It could be 2. So it could be acute. So this is not always true. So when you negate the statement, it might make an untrue statement. So that is not always true. Now we're going to look at what happens when you do negations and things like that. So if we have a statement that we are going to negate, so if you negate the hypothesis and the conclusion, then you form something called an inverse. So basically up here we would say this whole section here is an inverse. It's a negation, but we're negating both parts, so it's considered an inverse. If you negate, and that's just a negate of a statement, if you negate the hypothesis and conclusion of the converse. So we talked about converse. That's where you're flipping it. Then you form a contrapositive. So let me give you an example of a contrapositive. So if you negate the hypothesis and the conclusion of the converse, so we talked about converse, and converse means that you switch the hypothesis and the conclusion. So I'm going to turn the page and I'm going to give you an example. So we originally said the measurement of angle B was equal to 40 degrees. That's the if. The then was that angle B is acute. Now I'm just going to put original statement. Here's the original. Now I'm going to do the converse of that statement. So the converse of that statement is going to be if angle B is acute, then the measurement of angle B is equal to 40 degrees. The only statement that is true so far, completely true, is the original. And the converse, if angle B is acute, then the measurement of angle B is 40, is not necessarily true because there's many measurements for acute angles. Now, let's look at the inverse of the statement. So the inverse, remember, is going to be you negate the hypothesis and conclusion. So I'm going to negate. So if, and we already wrote this, the measurement of angle B does not equal 40 degrees, I'm just rewriting it as a visual, then angle B is not acute. And now let's look at the contrapositive. So as I said before, a contrapositive is when you negate the hypothesis and conclusion of the converse. So let's go up to our converse. It's right here. So we want to negate those. So if angle B is not acute, then the measurement of angle B is not 40 degrees. So that's how you form a contrapositive. I'm going to change it. You can say that, but let me change it to the VE. Let's look at each of those. The inverse and the converse are false, correct? Because if you say for the converse, if angle B is acute, then angle B equals 40 degrees. That's false. So we're going to write false here. The inverse says if angle B, the measurement of angle B, does not equal 40 degrees, then angle B is not acute. That's also false. Now let's look at our original. If measurement of angle B equals 40, then angle B is acute. Is that true? Yes. So we want to put true. If angle B on the contrapositive is not acute, then angle B does not equal 40. Is that true? Because if angle B is not acute, it could be any other thing. It could be right, it could be obtuse, it could be straight. Then angle B can't equal 40. Is that true? It is. So we have two true statements, the original and the contrapositive, and we have two false statements, the converse and the inverse. If two statements are both true or both false, so why don't we write that? If two statements are both true, which we saw in the original and the contrapositive, or both false, which we saw in the converse and the inverse, then they are called equivalent statements. Because they're both false or both true. So the original and the contrapositive in this case are equivalent statements with one another. The converse and the inverse in this case are equivalent statements with one another. So really focus on your vocabulary in this section, because that is where that's really what you're going to be tested on.